Can everyone hear me just fine? Okay, my name is
Yes.
Moza. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start, okay? My name is Moza Marzuki, a researcher at Trans, and I'll be telling you about today. So, Trans Research and Advisory continues its series of discussions and seminars as essential forums for debate and the dissemination of knowledge. Today's topic is of crucial importance, as it's increasingly a vital part of the future of global interactions and human progress. The space domain is a core issue in international relations due to its importance for innovation and global security. An increasing number of countries, including great powers, are developing space research and technologies to enhance their national security through advancing their military capabilities. Yet, the increasing interest in space also reflects increasing risks. The major gap between superpowers that compete in space and thus less powerful countries who could suffer from space incidents create a further division and defect in balancing debate on the topic. In that context, today's discussion reflects the increasing interest in and relevance of this issue. Trans Research and Advisory and the Secure World Foundation have pulled their efforts together to explore the subject. As a reminder, the specific topic of today's talk is Space Security and Stability and the Middle East, Relevance, Rights, and Responsibilities. Within the context of our topic, I reiterate that the Middle East remains one of the most important regions in the world, and such relevance remains even when discussing space and space security. I would like to introduce Dr. Stephen Blackwell, a scientific advisor and the director of the strategic department. You can go ahead, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Musa. I'd like to welcome everyone to this joint event. We have an exciting session ahead with some very distinguished and prominent speakers in this field. And in the interests of saving time, we hope to have a Q&A session at the end of the overall session. We have two panels first, and that is to be following that. We'll have a Q&A in which we'll try to present as many questions as possible and get as many insights as possible from our speakers. So I'll move along rapidly to panel one, which is entitled The Importance and Relevance of Space to the Middle East. And our first speaker is Crystal Azelton, the Director of the Space Application Programs at the Secure World Foundation in the United States of America. Crystal, if you'd like to start, and just before you do, I'd like to ask all the speakers to try to stay within a 10-minute limit, please, so we do have some time at the end of the session. Please, Crystal, the floor is yours.
Great. So first of all, just checking that you can hear me okay. Everything look good?
Yep.
Excellent. So thank you for the invitation to be here today to talk about this really important application for satellites and for space, and one of the most important ways during our times that space contributes to life on Earth. Since a couple of my colleagues are also participating in today's event, I wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to Secure World Foundation. We are a private nonprofit operating out of the United States, and our mission is space sustainability. So we're really looking at how to ensure international and national cooperation to improve safety, security, peacefulness, and the usefulness of outer space for the long term. We do this through a variety of publications, of events, of meetings, of research, and really try to represent a global and involve a global perspective on this. So I am particularly excited to be involved in today's events, particularly after the last 18 months where we haven't gotten to get around the globe and to make new contacts and then to really get out there in that way. To give you a sense of how we at Secure World think of space sustainability, it really touches on our topic today. So I work on an area that we call human and environmental security, but the way we like to explain it is we don't do space because it's fun or it's cool. We don't exist because, hey, we just really are all a bunch of space nerds and want to do this, although certainly that's true. We do this because of the benefits space has on Earth. And so the way that we use space technology, the value in the data and the understanding and the analysis that can be done, that's why it's important that we maintain the space atmosphere. And so today I'll be talking to you about one of those applications. It's been said that climate change is the poster child for the critical role of space data. It was one of the earliest ways that we were able to identify that they're a problem. It was NASA satellite data that revealed the frightening and growing hole in the ozone layer over the South Pole, galvanizing public opinion as far back as 1987 when we produced the Montreal Protocol, which was the first international agreement addressing global environmental problems. So really, this is not a new area of value. I do want to talk a little bit about what the crisis looks like. And so, today we are in an environment in which changes in the Earth's climate, which are inextricably linked to the changes in the Earth's biological, physical, and chemical systems, will have profound impacts on our health, on our livelihoods, on our well-being, and on our prosperity. This is true globally, and it's certainly true in the Middle East, and I'll talk about some examples as we go along. Our success in society in the face of those changes depends on the magnitude of those changes, the rate that they occur, and our ability to understand, anticipate, and prepare for them. And in order to do that, space plays an incredibly important role. Without space-based data, scientists cannot adequately observe and understand the impacts of changes to the Earth's climate, and policymakers won't be able to formulate effective strategies to respond to those changes. At COP24, so the one of the more recent events that we'll actually be having the next one in Glasgow in just a few months, or not even months now, a few weeks. One of the president of the United States General Assembly at that time for that climate change said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I think that's a really great way to think of this problem and what space can do. And so, skip ahead, I want to make sure I get to the area that I want to here. I wanted to give just a few examples of the way that space data is valuable. I think something that we all understand it on a basic level, like we've kind of heard of this, we've seen pictures, but depending on where you're coming from, the actual extent of how we use space data for this problem might not be something that you're super familiar with. We use it everything from measuring sea levels to tracking wildfires to measuring emissions to looking at deforestation, desertification, water levels, freshwater algae blooms, weather data, wildlife tracking. All of these things relate to climate change, and all of them are measured at least in part through satellite data. And essentially the way that I think of it is that data improves models. When we observe and understand, we get better at predicting. When we take this data and we understand the process that's at work, and then we can improve our models accordingly to predict better for the future, to truly be able to prepare and to think about the policies that are necessary. Ultimately, this information through direct observation or through the models that we created informs our choices. And the good news, and I think what's really helpful, is we have a lot of the technology. All of those examples are things that are already happening. They don't necessarily require new satellites, but we're also developing new technology. Countries around the world and organizations are identifying where their gaps and where their holes are, what they can't measure. A great example of partnerships, for instance, between academia, between government, and between commercial data is, for instance, methane tracking. So looking at what we're producing in our cities and through our various activities, and understanding that we could understand it on a very large level, but we couldn't track it at a slightly more minute level. And now there are companies and organizations that are in the process of creating much smaller, more agile satellites to do exactly that. And so all of this data works together. We have long-term data coming from government satellites around the world that have been around, like I said, for many decades. And then we have new data sources that are being developed to look at those. But essentially, the problem isn't that we don't have the technology, we do. We have the scientific expertise and the capability. But what we need to continue to do is to continue to think about what that looks like globally and for various regions around the world, and how we can all cooperate and address these various areas. The stakeholders in this sort of battle against climate change are really quite diverse. We're talking about individual scientists at organizations. We're talking about companies who need to understand their impact. We're talking about governments who need to participate in global climate change initiatives and to understand, what the best way forward is. And so one of the things that I wanted to mention in my last few minutes are just, what are some of the challenges and where do we need to look moving forward? And so just like any kind of data, things like continued investment, continuity of data, a growing and continued awareness of the importance of this data, because while it's certainly acknowledged to be important, that doesn't mean that every policymaker and every person everywhere who would benefit from it has access or awareness to it. Data access, in many ways, this data is quite accessible, but in other ways that can be difficult. I mean, something as simple as an internet connection, making sure that the data is interoperable with each other and with the different sources that a particular country or organization might have is incredibly important. Continuing training and capacity development. And then, as my organization always wants to mention, is space sustainability, ensuring that we have continuity data, both from putting the satellites in space and continuing to invest in this technology, then also making sure that once those satellites are on orbit, that they're going to be usable and effective and not have problems related to sustainability. This is an area that Secure World is very interested in, so I will put in a quick plug for some of our previous events, all of which are recorded and have transcripts. So I've given you this really brief, really quick overview of this important topic and some of the ways that space contributes. But if you'd really like to dive in and hear from some real global experts who this is their full-time job, please do check out our website, and you can type in climate change and you'll find two very recent events, one with the British Embassy and one at our Summit for Space Sustainability, where we really look at, what's next for climate action, and invited several speakers from around the world to talk about that. So with that, I'm getting close to time. I will go ahead and close down. Thank you again for having me here on this important topic. And I really encourage you to think about how space applications and the data affect everyone's lives, and really participate in important conversations like this so that we can continue to ensure that those benefits are available in the future.
Thank you very much, Crystal. A very interesting presentation, and re-emphasizing the important links between space exploration and potential applications to climate change. I'll move on immediately to our next speaker, who is speaking about space priorities and challenges in the Middle East, a geopolitical perspective. And this presentation will be given by Dr. Jill Stewart, who is a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science in London, in the UK. Please, Dr. Stewart, if you'd like to take the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. And can I just check that everyone can hear me okay?
You're very loud and clear here,
Great.
so I'm sure it's okay.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks so much for having me with this prestigious panel. And also, one of the nice things I think about things moving online is having a global audience. Yes, so let's see here. My name is Dr. Jill Stewart, and I'm going to be talking about, space priorities and challenges in the Middle East. And I've been asked to talk about a geopolitical perspective. I'm also on the board of trustees for METI International, which is Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And I used to be editor-in-chief of the journal Space Policy, and I'm still on the advisory board there, as are probably some of our audience members and at least one of the other panelists as well. When I was asked to speak today, I was reminded of an article that I wrote in 2014 by The Conversation. They contacted me and said the United Arab Emirates has announced that they have intentions to go to Mars. And so what does this mean for them as a country? And I wrote that article. And at the time, I think it was I was a bit optimistic, but a bit unsure about where this was going to go. So it's exciting to know that in February of this year, 7 years later, the Al-Amal probe, the HOPE probe, is safely orbiting the red planet. And so that has come to fruition. And I did follow then, other firsts for the UAE, an astronaut on the International Space Station in 2019, and the announcement of their intentions to go for a lunar mission, an uncrewed lunar mission in 2024. And of course, they're not the only country in the region who have space activities. Oman is looking to place their first satellite into orbit. Qatar has been involved in space activities. Egypt, Bahrain, and perhaps more notably Israel, who of course sent up a probe. It was technically a private project, but very much linked to the Israeli government, that crashed onto the surface of the moon previously. And so there is a lot of interest in space activity in the region. And in order to think about the geopolitical context of this, what I was asked to talk about today, I thought instead of focusing just regionally, I want to take a step back first and think about the more general question of why does any country invest in space activity? Space is very expensive and it's notoriously prone to not being successful and there being accidents. So why do countries invest in space activity in the first place? And then we can put that into the context of the Middle East. So in terms of main motivations, I would generally break this down into what I would call geopolitical and also noble motivations. I would highlight that these very much overlap. They're not two distinct categories. And so some sort of noble activities have geopolitical implications, and a lot of geopolitical activities will have noble spin-offs. But I'll go through what I mean by each of these. For geopolitical, we talk a lot about the interest in countries of investing in space activity for the purposes of power and prestige. And I think this is particularly when you see really highly visible activities such as exploration activities just for the purpose of exploration, or crewed activities. So these things that really capture global headlines. And it's a useful way for countries to establish their power and prestige within the global context. And this has long been the case going back to the beginning of the space age. Why does space activity usefully sort of fulfill this role? Is very expensive. So if a country can have a space program, you're demonstrating that you have a very strong economy. So you're demonstrating that you have a strong economy. Secondly, you're establishing that you have a very strong political situation. So your domestically, your political background is good. You have the ability to move forward with these sort of macro technology projects. And it also establishes that you're in good standing often in the international community, because particularly when you're engaging in international cooperative projects in space. So it establishes that political assuredness. It also demonstrates that you have strong technological capabilities. So you're at the forefront of technology because space is so difficult to access, as I said before. There's also a subtext there with regards to the technology. Space activity demonstrates that you have strong military capabilities. So space, as most of us know, is a force multiplier in the military environment. So if you have the capability to put benign objects in space, then the subtext is you have the capability to put things like intercontinental ballistic missiles into space, and that you have a space infrastructure that can help you in the theater of war. So again, this contributes to a country's ability to demonstrate their power. And then the last one is leadership. So demonstrating that you are a leader in the global community. But what I think is unique now, and going back now to the regional context, is increasingly countries are using space activity to demonstrate regional leadership. So to demonstrate that you are at the forefront of space activity within a particular region. And I think we're seeing some of that in terms of countries in the Middle East investing in space activity. Moving on to the more sort of noble purposes. So science, science, exploration, learning more. The Middle East in particular has a very long history of advancing astronomy, and as far back as the 8th century, and being at the forefront of that globally. So I don't want to underplay that as a reason. Also, science is useful in motivating younger generations to study STEM topics and other areas that could help shore up a country's economy, for example. Also, just for the purpose of advancing space infrastructure, we rely on space infrastructure so much now in terms of communications and navigation and so on. And so any country, I think, is going to have an interest in wanting to be able to build that up, which doesn't necessarily have overt geopolitical implications, but is more of a practical day-to-day purpose. Next, environmental monitoring, as Crystal just presented on, and this is something that I think we're seeing and coming up increasingly, which is a good thing. And then finally, development goals. You see countries countries such as India, for example, really linking their space activity to the purpose of wanting to enhance their development. So monitoring agricultural activity, providing better internet access for their citizenry, and so on. So I would just say that though I have divided these as sort of geopolitical and noble, first of all, they both overlap with each other, but also I think that they both go towards enhancing security. And I wanted to mention this. I don't want to go too much into security because that's what the next panel is about, but I wanted to briefly introduce that perhaps a bit as a segue as well. And what I think is interesting is the way that we're reconceptualizing what we mean by security when we talk about outer space. And these days, I think that the noble element of motivations for space activity also contribute to security. And this is because traditionally, I would say that we identified space security as being mainly about military security. So it was state-centric. It was about an individual country's right to defend themselves through space, to enhance their military capabilities from space, and because of the nature of dual-use technology, to actually have military infrastructure in space, if not weapons of mass destruction. So there's always been this element of space as enhancing military security. But in line with an evolving understanding of what we mean by security today, I think that now we also have within the definition of contemporary space security, this idea, okay, still space for security, so the more traditional idea of space in terms of defense, but also a desire for security in space. So the need to protect space infrastructure and space assets from both natural phenomenon, but also human intervention. So there's a greater understanding of how we need to, for example, establish space traffic management to ensure that there's an avoidance of collisions, and to recognize the importance of the infrastructure that we have in space and to protect it. So security in space. And then interestingly, and I've seen this again across other areas of international governance and international organization, the idea of security from space for individual humans and for the Earth environment. So using space to ensure that, to monitor things that are going to enhance people's life on Earth, things like monitoring migration and again, agriculture. And then very importantly, again, referring back to Crystal, the idea of monitoring the Earth environment from space. And so I think it's a good thing that we have come to conceive of these to securitize these notions as well, so that they collectively come into our understanding of the importance for outer space activity. And so in that sense, returning to the topic of the Middle East, I think it's very sensible that a lot of countries in that region are investing in outer space. And I think it's useful to recognize how that is benefiting them geopolitically as individual countries, but also contributing to a more collective effort to use space infrastructure to assure the safety and security of not only individual humans, but to the planet as a whole.
Hey, thank you very much, both our speakers. I'm particularly grateful that we're not only on schedule, we're a few minutes ahead of schedule, which perhaps would allow for more time for Q&A at the end. Or I don't know if Victoria, my co-moderator, are you ready now to take the second panel? Is that okay? I could have filled in some space with a few questions maybe, but if you're ready to go ahead, then I will hand over to you.
No, if you have some questions, let's do it. We'll break it up a little bit and then I'll do my portion. So why don't you do your questions?
I don't have any. I just have one very general question. Just occurred to me spontaneously after both the presentations on this panel. When we're talking about space programs, they're often depicted as national efforts. It requires almost a kind of national mobilization to run an effective space program. How can governments effectively involve the private sector? I mean, right across the entire spectrum of space-related activity. How can, what should be the public-private sector balance? How can governments involve entrepreneurs, I don't know, equity funding, whatever, research funding? I just wondered if you have some very brief general thoughts on that issue. Crystal.
Yeah, I can chime in a little on the application side, and then I'm sure Jill can speak a little bit more broadly. I think we have good examples of this. So, Earth application data is a place where we really see the value in long-term continuity of certain types of data. And a lot of that is done absolutely best by government. And also that many of the people who need this, and we've seen this over and over again, that the value of this kind of data really comes from its accessibility and its availability. And so, we would never ever say that you want to move away from that. However, that doesn't in any way preclude or mean that we don't need and want commercial data to be developed. I really see it as a synergy between the two. And I think what we're seeing in the last 10 years has really proven that out, that there are really specific types of data that it doesn't make sense for government to develop. And the government remains, as you said, a key partner in that, either because they're providing initial money or because they're planning to purchase it or integrate it with the data that they're creating. We've seen a lot of strides, for instance, in weather data in that area. And so, kind of just keeping that partnership between the two, supporting regulation that's helpful for commercial industry, I think is probably the other really important thing. Depending on what kind of known unknowns there are for different companies really influences what kind of companies develop and where they're housed and what they produce and how they produce it and how they sell it. And so I think governments should, always take a really good look at, how they're encouraging the development of these organizations and then the data that comes with it. And that comes both from the regulatory side as well as from the partnerships and purchase side. And really for all of these various applications, it's always going to be both. You need highly specific, very expensive data. You need long-term continuity of data. You need creative new applications. You need to develop the new technologies that we're continuing to see the value in. And those things really, they take place in both spheres and as part of partnerships, as you mentioned. And so I'm not sure what the exact balance is, other than I would always encourage, finding a balance between free and accessible and specific and purchasable data. And I don't think that's going to change, and I wouldn't want it to. We get a lot of benefits from the commercial industry, and they're capable of doing a lot of things that government just isn't particularly good at. But on the flip side of things, we have Landsat data going back decades, and we want to continue that data as a good example, and similar data sources out of Europe. So that was sort of my comments in those areas.
Thank you. And Jill, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's something that I get asked about increasingly, because I think with high profile stories about commercial entities in space, it's more sort of, people are more aware of this. But giving a more macro picture, I like to emphasize that actually public-private partnerships in space are far from new. We had the first commercial space activity in the 1970s. And the other thing I would emphasize is that I think sometimes we think of it as a dichotomy, government or private, but actually it's very messy in the middle. And so it was actually under Ronald Reagan, for example, in the 1980s, that United States was really pushing legislation to move research and development to the private sector. So it's not that I agree that we are seeing a lot more of it, and it's interesting, and I think that changes the political and economic and regulatory landscape. But I sometimes say that it rather than it being an evolution, it's more of a revolution, it's more of an evolution. So I think it's been a bit more gradual than people realize. So that's just to give a bit of background. In terms of how to go forward with it, I agree that there needs to continue to be regulatory oversight, because this changes the nature of how we govern these entities. And I think we also need to sort of have more conversations as with the public and as the global citizenry about what we want for space. Are we happy for there to be companies that are acting potentially not unilaterally in space, sort of representing us in space, and where we want that balance to lie. So to some degree, I think it's developing organically and in ways that individuals don't have that much control over, because there is a lot of money to be made in space. There are companies that are interested in it, and I don't think that's a bad thing. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't assume that therefore we don't have the ability to also reflect on what we want to be the outcomes from that increasing level of private activity now. And I don't have any easy answers for it, but I think it's something that's definitely interesting and worth thinking about politically, ethically, and economically for the future of space activity and exploration.
Thank you very much. Big questions, lots of interesting questions. I'm sure we'll return to these or aspects of these later in the Q&A. I should hand over now. I think we're almost approaching the half hour almost exactly. So I'd like to hand over proceedings to my co-moderator, Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. My colleague Crystal just talked about the Secure World Foundation, but just as a reminder, we're a private operating foundation that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We push for best practices and norms of behavior to ensure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. So our session is going to be focusing specifically on security and stability of space and the role that the Middle East can play in that. The space domain is undergoing a significant set of changes. A growing number of countries and commercial actors are getting involved in space, resulting in more innovation and benefits on Earth, but also more congestion and competition in space. From a security perspective, an increasing number of countries are looking to use space to enhance their military capabilities and national security. Most of the space applications they are developing are not new. What has changed is the proliferation of these capabilities beyond just superpowers. This creates a risk that incidents in space can spark or escalate conflict on Earth. As well, the actual use of offensive counterspace capabilities could have long-lasting consequences for humanity, whether through the loss of critical space capabilities that underpin global economy and societies, or through the creation of long-lived space debris that hinders future space activities. Multilateral discussions on space security are stuck. They have not been able to make much progress on space security issues and been having the same arguments for decades. Furthermore, given geopolitical complexities, the gulf between various established space powers as to what is considered to be a space security threat is widening. Meanwhile, emerging space actors are not substantially engaged beyond rhetoric, yet space security and stability affects everyone. In order to truly see that space continues to be accessible to and usable for all over the long term, all stakeholders should be part of the conversation about how best to work toward a predictable, stable domain. It is important to improve the capacity of all actors to understand the relevance of space security to their continued benefiting from space, and to ensure that the solutions generated meet the needs for all space stakeholders. So that's the reason why the Secure World Foundation and Trends Research and Advisory are co-hosting these panel sessions today. We wanted to highlight the importance of space to the people of the Middle East and to discuss why space security matters, discuss the current state of counterspace capabilities globally, and the role all countries can play in multilateral discussions on space security and identifying responsible behavior in orbit, and the path forward to generating progress in the multilateral fora in these issues. So we've got a fantastic panel today. I'm really excited to hear their thoughts. I'm just going to introduce people as they speak. So our first speaker is my colleague, Dr. Brian Whedon, who is the Director of Program Planning for the Secure World Foundation and has nearly 2 decades of professional experience in space operations and policy. He directs strategic planning for future year projects to meet the foundation's goals and objectives, and conducts research on space debris, global space situational awareness, space traffic management, protection of space assets, and space governance. He also organizes national and international workshops to increase the awareness of and facilitate dialogue on space security, stability, and sustainability subjects. He is a member and former chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Space Technologies, a former member of the Advisory Committee on Commercial Remote Sensing to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the Executive Director of the Consortium for Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing Operations, or CONFERS. Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Trends for inviting me to participate in this. I'm going to quickly share my screen as I have a couple of slides I'm going to be walking through as I go through my overall comments this morning. So I thought I would get things started today by talking about the counterspace threats and how they have changed over time as sort of a grounding point for our discussion about sort of the impacts that has on security and stability in space and of course terrestrially. Counterspace capabilities are those developed by one country to counter or neutralize another country's space capabilities. So what specifically are we talking about? Well, this chart shows how we characterize different categories of counterspace capabilities, which includes both destructive and non-destructive. So within this, we have what we call both direct ascent satellite weapons and co-orbital anti-satellite weapons. And these are more on the destructive side. So these are interceptors that are launched from the ground or aircraft or ships that can be used to collide with satellites and destroy them through force of impact, or in the case of co-orbital, could be placed into orbit themselves and then maneuvering to alter their orbit to approach a target and attack it either by collision or by a variety of other means. We also have directed energy weapons. These are focused energy such as laser, particle, microwave beams that again could be used for either destructive purposes such as destroying solar panels, or non-destructive interference such as interfering with optical sensors. Electronic warfare are weapons that use radio frequency energy to interfere with, or in some cases outright jam, communications and other types of signals to and from satellites. Cyber weapons are, of course, extraterrestrially. They're used software and network techniques to interfere with computer systems, and satellites themselves are increasingly computer systems, but also are controlled by ground facilities that contain computer systems. So you can imagine a cyber attack could be used against a ground control facility or against the satellite itself. And finally, while not a category of weapon itself, there's this concept of space situational awareness, which is knowledge about the space environment and human activities in space. And this is important because it enables both the ability to track, identify, and target satellites for offensive capabilities, but also space situational awareness allows you to detect potential threats and to potentially defend against them. So we include this in our assessment because SSA is important for both offense and defense. Like most things space related, the story of how these capabilities were originally developed starts during the Cold War. All of these different categories were explored to some extent by the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and several of these different categories were tested and a few operationally deployed by either the United States or the Soviet Union. Towards the end of the Cold War, the United States started developing space capabilities that had much more direct warfighting benefits and applications. Things like the global positioning system, military satellite communications, and reconnaissance and intelligence collection satellites. And from 1990, we have seen these military use of space spread globally. This was led by the United States, who showed sort of the value of this for military applications, starting with the NATO campaign in Kosovo in the 1990s, and then later the first Gulf War, and then operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, really sort of cemented the potential value of space to enhance and enable military operations. While the United States still has that most robust integrated space capabilities, there are now dozens of countries around the world that are looking for how they may use space capabilities for their own national security benefits. That includes not only, as I mentioned, satellite communications, intelligence, reconnaissance, but also missile warning and other types of strategic warning, and just generally improving their conventional military capabilities. As a result, this growing use of space for military capabilities has in turn helped prompt a resurgence in development of counterspace capabilities. And to give you a sense of the timeline, this chart sort of shows just the anti-satellite testing in space piece of this. And you can see that there was quite a bit of anti-satellite testing done in space by the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War. but this tailed off in the 1990s. And there was a period between 1995 and 2005 where we didn't see any anti-satellite test in space. Then starting in 2005, the testing is ramped up again. And in this case, it's being done differently by, there's now 4 countries involved. The United States and Russia have both done at least one anti-satellite test in this new era, but they've been joined by China and most recently India. And there are some signs that there may be additional countries that may decide to join in the future. What we have here is a chart from our report, which I'll get to in a minute, our assessment of where the different countries today are focusing their development efforts in those categories I mentioned previously. And this is based on all open source reporting, so there may be additional development going on that is still that we don't know about or has been reported, but this is a pretty good assessment based on what is out there. What you can see is there's a number of countries, including the major space powers, Russia, China, United States, but also other countries, France, India, Iran, Japan, North Korea, and even a few more who are at least exploring some of these capabilities. One thing I'll note is that what we are seeing the most developed and also used operationally in military campaigns today are non-destructive capabilities, electronic warfare, and to a certain extent, directed energy for dazzling and cyber capabilities. And that is a bit of good news in that those capabilities have less of a long-term sustainability impact on the space environment than destructive capabilities that may be destroying entire satellites and creating long-lived orbital debris. That said, we are seeing 3 or 4 countries, 4 countries now and perhaps more in the future, that are at least doing research and development and testing of destructive capabilities. And the question is whether or not they might be used in future conflicts. So I will close with links to 2 publications you can find to get more details about this. On the left is the report that Secure World Foundation puts out annually, Global Counterspace Capabilities, that has all the details you could ever want on what various countries are developing for counterspace capabilities. On the right is a companion report from our colleagues at the Center for Strategic International Studies that talks more about how one might defend or protect the satellites against these different categories of space systems. Both reports are freely available at the links on those websites below. And I will conclude my remarks there. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Brian. That was a great overview of counterspace capabilities. And I'm sure if the audience has questions about further stuff, it's been something happening in the news recently. I feel like China might have done something. We'll probably discuss it more during the Q&A. Our next speaker is Almudena Azcárate Ortega, who is an associate researcher in the WMD program at UNIDIR. Her research focuses on space security and missiles. Prior to joining UNIDIR, Almudena was a research assistant at Georgetown University Law Center, where she is currently an SJD, a PhD equivalent candidate. She also holds an LLM in national security law from the same institution, where she is a recipient of Georgetown's Thomas Bradbury Chetwood S.J. Prize for the most distinguished academic performance in the program. Almudena received her LLB from the University of Navarra. She is admitted to practice law in Spain, and prior to her studies at Georgetown, she was a practicing attorney at the Spanish law firm Uria Menendez, where she specialized in international arbitration and litigation. Almudena, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you, Victoria, for that introduction, and thank you, Secure World Foundation and Trends Research and Advisory for inviting me here today. I'm so pleased to be sharing this panel with people that whose work I really admire and I have cited very often in my work. So this is very exciting for me to be here. So before I start, I'd like to just say a little disclaimer that anything that I say here today doesn't necessarily reflect the opinions or the views of the United Nations or UNIDIR. It's just my own opinions. Having said that, I would like to say, if for those who maybe aren't aware, that a couple of weeks ago at UNIDIR in Geneva, we organised our annual Outer Space Security Conference, which Secure World Foundation partners in organising. And we talked a lot about several space security issues. Many of which, Victoria, you raised during your introduction, and Brian during your remarks just now. So I am going to try to talk about the highlights of this conference, which are also reflective of the highlights of what is happening in the international scene when it comes to space security. So as it was already pointed out, although the desire to ensure peace and security in space has gained particular importance in recent years, this is not a new concern of the international community. Space security has been an issue of concern for the international community pretty much since the first successful launch of an artificial satellite, which is, as everybody knows, Sputnik in October of 1957. And it was then that the importance of outer space as a domain useful for military purposes became apparent. And this perception has only increased as more and more states have become more proficient in the use of space technology. And the international community realized how much our world and our way of life really depends on space quite some time ago, back then in the 50s, in the 60s. And it is due to this that COPIOS came to be, the Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated and enacted in 1967. However, the Outer Space Treaty is just a treaty of principles that allows spacefaring states a lot of freedom of action. This has been a very good thing in many respects because it has encouraged the ingenuity that made things like, for example, the emergence of the commercial space industry possible. But from the security perspective, such freedom has been found to have its downsides too. So, for example, the Outer Space Treaty bans the placement and the stationing in space, as well as the installation on celestial bodies of weapons of mass destruction, but it doesn't really say anything about conventional weapons. It doesn't also bar the peaceful military uses of space. It only bars those that are aggressive, at least according to the most common interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. And so today, a growing number of militaries rely on space-based capabilities, and states are also dedicating military units and forces to warfighting in space. They have also reflected this in their domestic policies, considering space to be an operational or even a warfighting domain. And as Brian indicated, at least 4 states have conducted ground-based anti-satellite tests. And all of this contributes to heightening the tensions among the members of the international community. Armed conflict in space, if these tensions were to evolve into a fully blown armed conflict in space, the consequences would be absolutely catastrophic. Precisely because space has become so essential to our daily lives, and space technology controls or at least supports critical infrastructure that we need and we have come to rely on. So these concerns are why the notion of PARAS, the prevention of an arms race in outer space, came to be. This concept made its first appearance in the UN General Assembly back in 1978. But the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva has had the primary responsibility for negotiating issues on PARAS. But unfortunately, it has, in the past over 40 years, not been terribly successful, sadly. And issues concerning space security are also discussed in the first committee at the UN General Assembly, which is happening right now, as it happens. But the topic, the topic here is not an easy one either, because, states discuss whether the focus should be on capabilities or whether it should be on behaviors, or whether the regulations that apply should be legally binding or whether they should be voluntary. So efforts to come up with a solution have not been very successful up until now. There were some efforts to come up with a treaty, a legally binding treaty, which was proposed by Russia and China back in 20. When was this? 2008, yes, 2008. But since then, it hasn't received enough support from the international community to move forward. Other measures have been proposed. They also have not been very successful up until yet, but things aren't so bleak. And this is something that was discussed in our Outer Space Security Conference. In fact, in 2020, at the end of last year, the United Kingdom started a new conversation on the issue of powers when it introduced Resolution 7536, which deals with the reduction of space threats to norms and rules and principles of responsible behaviors. And it called on states to identify what responsible behaviors or irresponsible behaviors would look like, and try to encourage states to propose this from a sort of bottoms-up approach. States submitted their comments, and these comments were put together into a Secretary General report, which was released this summer. And it was pretty successful. So around 30 states submitted comments. Almost every spacefaring state had something to say about this, as well as many non-state actors, such as organizations like UNIDO, for example, and Secure World Foundation. And these submissions, what they did, they highlighted a lot of similarities and concerns among the members of the international community, even among members that have traditionally held views that have been viewed as as opposed or as non-compatible. The process, this submission process, highlighted that it isn't necessarily the case. It also highlighted that the concerns are very much the same for everyone. So, for example, most states said that space debris was a huge concern, that interference with space objects was also a great concern. And so this dialogue that started with this resolution has been very, very encouraging in that sense. And it has encouraged the UK, and I suppose that the rest of the international community, to continue this conversation. This was something that we talked at length during OS21. We had several participants from all over the world, which represented all of these different perspectives: binding, non-binding agreements, behaviors or hardware. And it was very encouraging to see all of these representatives talking in the same conference, and just being able to maybe not reach a final decision on any of these issues, but at least have the willingness to reach common understandings and move the conversation forward. And the UK seeks to continue to do this now. And in fact, they want to propose a follow-up resolution to this Resolution 7536. And they seek to create an open-ended working group to consider threats and recommend norms and rules and principles of responsible behavior based on these comments that states sent or submitted to the Secretary General report. This was something, in fact, that Ambassador Lizzle mentioned at OS21. And it's the UK's willingness to continue to foster dialogue among the international community. And this was echoed by countries like Russia and China, who were also present at the Outer Space Security Conference. And as I said, the Secretary General reports provided a very good basis for this discussion. It made possible identify points in common among states that have traditionally held opposing views. highlighting that these views are commonly termed as opposing, but aren't necessarily the case. They can, in fact, be compatible. So countries like many European countries, like France or the European Union itself, they expressed how these norms of behavior could be a very good form of confidence building measures. And countries who have traditionally vouched for a binding agreement to solve these issues recognize as well that even though we must not lose track of that final goal that would be ideal, which is a binding agreement for them, norms could be a very helpful stepping stone to get there. So it was very good to see all that consensus come to be during the conference, and I think this has been replicated during the first committee discussions these past 2 or 2.5 weeks. So this spirit of cooperation is very encouraging indeed, and it is a reflection also of the Secretary General's Common Agenda, which is the UN's new agenda for peace, which also involves a multi-stakeholder dialogue regarding issues relating to outer space and outer space security. And this is something that we also addressed during OS 21, which is the need to not just include states and spacefaring states in these discussions, but also states that are not necessarily spacefaring, but that do benefit from the use of space, which is practically every single state out there, and also include non-governmental entities such as the commercial industry. So I look forward to conversations such as the one that we're having here and other conversations in other fora like the UN First Committee, etc. moving forward. I think it's an exciting time to be talking about this because although we're not there yet, I think the progress that we've been seeing is definitely encouraging.
I share your optimism. I think this is an exciting time, and maybe we can talk some more during the Q&A about, various options and paths that can take to help ensure the success of these new thinking on space security and multilateral fora. Okay, our next speaker, we'll be talking about the current status of space security and stability, is Kazuto Suzuki, coming at us from Tokyo. Thank you, Kazuto. I know it's very late for you. Kazuto Suzuki is a professor of science and technology policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo, Japan, and is senior fellow of Asia Pacific Initiative, an independent policy think tank. He graduated from the Department of International Relations with Simicon University and received a PhD from Sussex European Institute, University of Sussex, England. He has worked in the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique in Paris, France, as an assistant researcher and associate professor at the University of Tsukuba from 2000 to 2008, and served as professor of international politics at Hokkaido University until 2020. He served as an expert in the panel of experts for the Iranian Sanction Committee under the United Nations Security Council from 2013 to July 2015. He currently serves as the president of Japan Association for International Security and Trade. His research focuses on the conjunction of science, technology, and international relations, subjects including space policy, non-proliferation, export control, and sanctions. His recent work includes Space International Politics, 2011 in Japanese, awarded the Centauri Prize for Social Sciences and Humanities, Policy Logics and Institutions of European Space Collaboration, 2003, and then many others. Kazuto, thank you for being willing to talk to us. Let's hear about the current status of space security and stability.
Right. Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you very much, Secure World Foundation and the Trends Research and Advisory for inviting me for this workshop. I am very interested. As Victoria mentioned, I was working as a member of the panel of experts on the sanctions on Iran, so I have some attachment to the international order in the Middle East. So I think this is a great opportunity to speak to the audience. in the Middle East and the rest of the world who are interested in this this issue. So the current state, as Arundhati discussed in, the couple of weeks ago, there was an OS 21, and there was a discussion among the diplomats and the state representative, including the experts like ourselves. I think most of us were in the OS 21 in this panel. The state of the space security is quite difficult and dire, and largely because there is a sort of two trends in space. On the one hand, there is the increasing importance of space in economy, society. Everyone uses GPS, everyone uses telecommunications, and the importance is becoming much more and more increasingly important. But on the other hand, space is used for the military security strategic purposes, and some countries think that the space is the area of the strategic power domain, which means that the space is the place where there is a war fighting going on, and if you attack and you dismiss the capability of space, then it will be the strategic advantage against the others. So on the one hand, this is a very peaceful use, commercial activities, civilian activities, but on the other hand, it is a strategic domain, and there are two kinds of people working in the space, creating this space order, international order. One is those who are more commercially driven, for those people who are working on the civilian side, who wants to maintain the stability. But on the other hand, the group of people who are not willing to have the stability, and there will be an opportunity for the maximizing the state capabilities to control over a situation in space. So this is the sort of a current this is the sort of a starting point on the basis of the discussion on how to develop the certain order in space. And one of the technical aspect of this space is that space is very vulnerable. It's very hard to protect the spacecraft from the direct kinetic attacks, but also from the non-kinetic attack, as Brian explained. The cyber attack and electronic warfare. These are easily targeting the satellite and space infrastructure, and if you degrade the space infrastructure, then countries may think that this is their strategic advantages. So there is a lot of incentives to attack on someone's spacecraft, and this incentive, this willingness of using space for the strategic domain and the attacking of the spacecraft is the one that we need to concern. And of course, other than these intentional attack, there is a growing issue of the non-intentional accidents or collisions, or the risks for the spacecraft, which is the space debris issue. So we are now facing basically two challenges. One is how to avoid this sort of intentional disruption of the international order, and the other is how to avoid the risks that may caused by the space debris and others. So because of these two challenges, I think we need to reconsider the overall framework of how this space order should be, and how to improve the stability in space. And I think this is particularly important for the users of space, including Japan and countries in the Middle East. These and everyone else who are using space as the basic infrastructure for society, economic activities, for weather forecasting, etc., etc. So this, in order to reconfigure the international order in space, one of the issue that we need to be aware of is that the space is a very mixed environment, which is a mix of civilian aircraft, commercial aircraft, civilian spacecraft, commercial spacecraft, and the military spacecraft, and also the space is the geographical area where the nuclear missiles are going through. So how to control the traffics in space, and this is where when people start talking about the space traffic management. Unfortunately, there is no fixed definition of what space traffic management is, and there is no single rules to regulate the traffics in space. But other important element of the understanding of the international space order is that the space is not the kind of domain that can be applied the traditional power structure in the international order. On the terrestrial relationship on the Earth, the international order is based on the geography. If you are a country, you have the country and you need to protect your own soil, and you have the governance mechanism in your country within the limited geographical regions. So when it comes to the warfighting situation, what you need to do is to protect your territory, protect your assets, protect your the area where you control. The problem is that you can't really control geographically in space. So what you need to do is to protect the individual spacecraft which are circling around the Earth. It is vulnerable, and it is moving all the way, and it is facing the danger of colliding with debris, and therefore securing the spacecraft and the space system needs to have the certain understanding of where they are and what is going to hit and how others behave in space. And this is where the space situational awareness comes in. Brian has explained that the space situational awareness is important to understand what's going on in space and try to improve the transparency. The key word here is the transparency, because you need to understand not only the physical location of the spacecraft and debris, but also the movement of spacecraft, so that you can understand the intention, why this this spacecraft is moving from one orbit to another and attacking, to approaching to other spacecraft, which may be a hostile spacecraft. So this may be creating a concern. So it's not just important to have the transparency of the location, but it is also important to demonstrate the intention. Because if you don't know the intention of why others are moving, then you become suspicious. And this suspicion is the problem of this anxiety and the imbalance in the international order. So in order to reduce this sort of a lack of transparency of intent and lack of transparency of the actions, we need to improve the space situational awareness, and we need to improve the exchange of information and declaration of the intent. So what Japan is doing now, in addition to the British initiative at the UN General Assembly, is that Japan is trying to set up a very high standard of the transparency for any Japanese spacecraft to demonstrate their intent and declare where they're going, what they're going to do, and clarify clarify their actions and reduce the uncertainty, reduce increase the transparency to make sure that everyone feel comfortable and safe by seeing that the spacecraft is moving from one orbit to another, and to make sure that can be verified by the SSA. So this is a unilateral approach, but the Japanese government is hoping that this will improve the environment in space, and hopefully other countries follow this this practice. And we are aiming to set the precedent and the sort of a normative standard that this is the way in which that you do approach to other spacecraft, or remove debris, or supply fuel to the other spacecraft. And any movement in space needs to be transparent and create the environment where people feel more secure by their own voluntary actions. Of course, this is not legally binding, and this is not the sort of ultimate solution. But I think, given the circumstances that things are not progressing in terms of the intergovernmental negotiation, I think we need to do something and start some point to take some actions to improve the situation in space security. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Kazuto. Absolutely, transparency is going to be key to increasing confidence in whatever solutions the National Committee comes up with. And along those lines, we'll be hearing from Dr. Jessica West, who'll be talking about space security and stability, focusing largely on norms behavior. Jessica is a senior researcher at Project Plowshares, a Canadian Peace and Security Research Institute. Her research and policy work is interested in technology, security, and governance, with a particular focus on peace and security in outer space. She holds a PhD in global governance and international security from the Basile School of International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University. Jessica?
Great, thank you. This is the moment of truth. Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me? Excellent. My computer was wonking out earlier today, but it came through, like technology hopefully always does and will in space. I'm going to pick up on a lot of the themes that we've been discussing this morning. So I'm so excited by everyone's talks. We've heard from Brian and Kazuto and Almudena that we face many challenges when it comes to security and stability in outer space, and we've kind of been stuck when it comes to global governance. And I have sort of 3 propositions for you in this talk. The first is that norms can help. And I'll get to that in a minute. But echoing what Victoria was mentioning about the importance of global and collective governance in outer space, norms are really the glue of collective governance, and I'm going to try to make that case. But they can also help us address challenges with security and stability within the broader framework of security that Jill was talking about, that includes a diverse set of actors and non-traditional security risks, as well as security needs in outer space. And the third point I want to make to you is that we all have a role to play every day. And it was fascinating to hear Kazuto talk about what Japan is trying to do individually But I think every single day, operators in outer space and states that are using space and talking about it diplomatically have a role to play on advancing norms of good behavior. And so I'm going to end with that. So that's the big snapshot of what I hope to talk about. First, though, what do I mean by norms? It's a word that gets thrown out a lot. We don't always mean the same thing, and it's kind of fuzzy, which helps from a governance perspective until you get down to the nitty-gritty. Norms, the way I use it, refer to standards of accepted behavior in any domain, really. It can be in everyday life, it can be in space, it can be on the oceans. But I think they have sort of three key criteria. The first is behavior. Norms are reflected in behavior, and that's generally what we're speaking about, particularly in space security when we talk about norms of behavior. So the actions and practices that are common and that we adopt ourselves. The second is shared values. Normative behaviors are generally rooted and inspired by and motivated by shared values and principles and social expectations about what is appropriate. So this is a collective process, not just an individual, here's what I think the rules are process. And the third is expectations of compliance. Norms are often contrasted with law, and I find this very frustrating. We often speak about voluntary norms of behavior. Norms aren't really voluntary if they're working well. There is an expectation that for the most part, they're observed and followed by other actors, or else they're not a norm. And so I like to use the word ought, and I use this with my children as well. There are things we know we ought to do, and so they might be voluntary, but there's strong expectations that we follow through with these behaviors. And we notice when the behavior is not followed. We notice when norms are violated, and that's how you tell when there's a norm. Not how many people are always following, but do we take notice when it's not being followed? And I want to give you a really random example because I think it's helpful and powerful to take a step back from space and think about it more broadly. And this is one that happens to me often. And it's cultural, and it's a great example. But if I say to you, shoes on or off in the home, you probably have a very strong reaction to that question about what the proper expectation is. And you probably think, why do you even have to ask? It is so obvious. And yet some of us might have different responses to that question, which also show that norms are social, they're cultural, they're contextual, but they generate strong reactions about what's right and what's wrong. And I think that's the key takeaway. And that's the essence of norms. And so now that I've been talking about shoes, you're probably wondering what norms have to do with strategic stability. And I'm going to walk you through a few ways in which norms contribute to stability at the strategic level as well as at the operational level in space, particularly when we have sort of stalled diplomatic processes. First of all, going back to Kazuto's talk, norms influence how we interpret events and the behaviors of others. They help us to know when we should worry about something and when we don't have to, by defining normal behavior and providing reassurances about intentions. And so Kazuto's example about close approaches and the kinds of transparency rules that Japan is trying to champion and pioneer are a really good example of how an expectation of what a responsible state or responsible operator might be doing can make you feel less concerned if a satellite is getting close to you and inspecting you, or if it released something odd from space. Whereas if those rules weren't followed, you probably have a lot more reason to worry. And if we don't have any rules, you're worrying every single time and you're constantly trying to figure out what's happening. And this is a situation that can very easily give rise to the escalation of conflict. And that's because tools that help us to interpret the behaviors of others can also help us avoid misinterpreting the behaviors of others. And it's this misinterpretation of one another that is often a key driver of unintended conflict escalation and instability. But it's not just at this sort of individual level of activities and incidents. I think norms also help with stability at the macro level. Many behavioral rules and practices serve as transparency and confidence building measures. So I'm channeling Kazuto again. These are also known as TCBMs, and they're primary tools of stability. They're often present in even formal legal arms control agreements and strategic stability agreements, but they can also operate at a less formal level of information exchange and other behaviors that help build trust, or at least help reduce mistrust, which really is core to stability at the strategic level. And at the operational level, transparency through better communication practices is also essential. Norms can also address some of the insecurity and instability that's derived from particularly threatening weapon systems, especially those that are linked to technology that is either emerging or dual use or rapidly changing or all three, and can be difficult to restrict or hasn't yet been restricted in any formal sense. So here the focus is on not technology and capabilities per se, but how they're used. And a focus on behavior can help support rules or restrictions on how certain capabilities are used, or to distinguish different types of users, nefarious from friendly, and even to create rules on potential targets. And that can really help to tamp down a potential arms control and contribute to strategic stability. And finally, norms can help to stabilize our legal regimes and fill in the details about how laws are interpreted and how we put them into practice, or how we address potential conflicting norms and principles in outer space. And so that comes back to that key point that norms really are the glue of collective governance. So now that I've sold you, hopefully, on the value of norms, how can we develop this tool when it comes to security and stability in outer space? From my own perspective in the work that I'm doing, I think it's really important to start with an understanding of where we already are. Last year, I spent a considerable amount of time probing what I call the existing normative map in space, with a focus on two key questions. What kind of norms already exist? What are the key values and principles and rules that we've already
Jessica, I think you're frozen. Jessica, we might need you to hang up and call back. 3, 2, 1. Okay. While Jessica sorts out her technical issue.
Am I back?
Yeah,
Sorry,
there you are. You're good.
Okay.
I was just about to fling you to the wolf, so you're good.
Okay, it's saying that my internet connection is unstable, which is really weird because I pay an arm and a leg for good internet, and I'm the only one here, but I'll keep going. So norms, why do we need to have a big picture perspective, and why do we need to understand what is already in place? Norms are relational. They exist in relation to one another. And so we know that when we're operating in space, we don't operate without an awareness and an accommodation of others. And the same is true of norms. Individual rules don't exist independently of others, and they certainly don't exist separate from the prevailing values that inform and motivate conduct. And so I think we need to take this framework into consideration if we're going to try to develop new norms to solidify our governance efforts in space. So when I did this mapping exercise, what did I find? I could pull up a slide, but because my internet's unstable, I'm not going to. But I'll tell you what I found. First, it was promising because we do have a lot of shared core values in space that are already informing activities there. You probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that the biggest themes that we discovered were sustainability and safety. Those are our very core values, and we have quite a few rules and activities that have rules surrounding them already in place. But conflict prevention, strategic stability, and transparency are also key values in this picture. But when we tried to look at the norms that might already exist or the activities that we have rules for when it links to these values, there's kind of a big blank spot on the map. And that, I think, is the challenge for us when it comes to space governance and stability and security in space, is filling out that section of the map in a way so that it still corresponds to the rest of the map and the big picture and our goals for safety and sustainability as well. How can we do this? How can we create more and better norms in space? For me, I think the key is process. I've been doing a lot of reading on cyber norms and following what has been happening in that domain. And I'm left with the impression that the process really is the product. It's how we do norms that matters. At the end of the day, norms are not a collection of words on paper. Norms really are the way in which we interact with one another at both a strategic and an operational level, the behaviors that we observe and the processes that we follow.
Okay, Jessica, you're frozen again. We might need to move on just for the sake of time because we still have one more speaker and we'd like to get on to the Q&A. So, all right. Sorry, Jess. We're gonna have to come back to you after, if we have time after the last speaker. Our last speaker, looking ahead to improving space security and stability, is Andre Ripple. Andre is a career diplomat from Brazil who's been working with international corporations since 2011. One of his key interests is multilateral diplomacy, and space diplomacy is his pet subject. Before moving to Moscow, where he heads the ST&I section of the Brazilian embassy, he was based in Vienna, where he led the Brazilian delegation at COPUOS, which he also chaired in 2019. Andre, thank you for joining us.
Oh, hi, Victoria. Actually, I should say Mashal Hayat, right? Since this is an event geared towards the Middle East. I don't know, Jessica is back. Maybe she would like to conclude. No? I would be fine with that. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I know this was, you know, like a last minute thing, but I'm very happy to share my insights. I mean, these are all my personal views, of course, not government views. I'm speaking in my personal capacity. And I joined just to listen to Suzuki, Professor Suzuki speak. So I apologize if I, you know, accidentally just repeat some arguments that were put forward, because I think what I've heard so far is very good and in line with many of the ideas that I've been, you know, dealing with in my capacity as a diplomat and negotiating things in Vienna. Well, one of the key points that I like, and Jessica was just saying that about process being key. I think this is a key element, because the way we move forward will determine how successful we are. And there has to be trust. The actors involved in negotiating any kind of set of norms or rules or regulations or guidelines, then you can pick and choose whatever word you want. They need to really trust that what they are doing in earnest, and what each other is doing it in earnest. So I think one starting point for that, and that's a question that I've asked during, you know, several different negotiations, is what do we hope to achieve and what do we want to agree on? And I think a starting point, rather than just saying, well, you know, we need to prevent an arms race, we need to build trust. I mean, we all agree. I don't think anyone would disagree on that. But what do we want? We want a stable environment. We do not want to see a conflict in space. And I really like a reference that Professor Suzuki made. It's something that I've asked also when we were talking about sustainability. And, you know, there was guideline 7 that was never approved, but referred to the idea that space should be used only for peaceful purposes. Is what, how can you have a conflict in space? Because that's something totally different from having, even if you talk about an unilateral act of aggression on Earth, that will be geographically delimited, that will be aimed at a specific actor. If you have an incident, not to mention an act of aggression in space, you'll be harming the whole environment. And if you think of debris and everything else, you may be affecting a lot of other people that are not even, connected to the matter. So you do not have the characteristics of a conflict on Earth, definitely not. So, these are all common points that all actors should understand. So we need to understand that there is a shared value that we want space to remain stable and in a way that can be used by all. And then that's where, okay, we all agree on that, but that's, where problems start, because I see that sometimes concepts such as deterrence, resilience, and similar concepts that, we bring as a kind of baggage, and I use the word on purpose. It's baggage that comes from times of the Cold War, and concepts that are very old are suddenly applied to space, where they do not necessarily make sense, or they would mean something completely different, because the consequences would be far more dramatic. So we really have to, in a sense, perhaps revisit these concepts, but also sometimes I think dismiss them and say, listen, we cannot be talking about deterrence and resilience in space. I understand that these are important concepts for the national security community and other players, but how do you make sense of it? Are you really going to tell me that you can, if, let's say, worst case scenario, you have the destruction of an object, you can determine that this was conducted on purpose, it's an act of aggression, and what are you going to do? Destroy more objects in return and just make things worse? No, you need to find some other solution. So of course we want to avoid that, but I think it's important that when we come to a negotiation, we understand that this is what we are talking about. We are not talking about using drones or missiles or whatever, or bombs or whatever. I mean, it's something completely different. So in practical terms, and I think I heard, that being referred to by our previous speakers, we need to work on, in a sense, an interplay and increased dialogue between all these different actors. I mean, we are not talking only about the diplomatic community. We can think about traditional diplomacy as such, but we need to be a bit more flexible. We need to work on an interplay between Geneva, Vienna, and New York. We need to be a bit daring, I would say, and think outside the box, in the sense that we kind of come to a meeting and say, oh no, we do not talk about that here. Okay, we do not talk about it here, but we need to understand that this is an important concept. And I heard that a lot when we referred to Vienna being the seat of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Oh, so we don't talk disarmament here. No, we do talk about disarmament here, in the sense that we want to preserve space as a peaceful environment. So don't give me that we don't talk disarmament here. Okay, we are not going to negotiate PAROS. We are not going to negotiate a PPWTO, whatever, but we have to be aware of why such issues are important in Geneva. And we need to understand how these things are being discussed in New York. So, and for diplomats, that's quite important, because I noticed also that very often, and I'm not blaming anyone, I think this is just something that happens. It's part of the whole structure, I would say, the way things happen. Depending on where you come from and the diplomatic service you're attached to, you have a different mindset, and you also work things and say, okay, I'm coming here, I'm a specialist, I have these inputs from my space agency, from my legal department, or whatever. And very often you will need to understand that you come across people that don't have the same background, and they don't have the same backup. So they need to come and look at these issues, from based on their own expertise, if we could use the word, and they don't have anyone to resort to. Say they also need to be sometimes educated. We cannot just come to a discussion and say, okay, these are the big four players, 5, 6, whatever, that will have a say in this issue, and the others do not participate. And everybody has a stake. And then I come to another point that is not only the diplomatic community. So you need to understand then that there are different degrees or levels of awareness among diplomatic players. But then we also need to look at how we include, and that's something, you know, that I think everyone is quite aware of, but I don't think we have found a solution to that. How do we include all these other players from private sectors that work across borders internationally, and they have other interests? And of course, they would hate to see a conflict in space, because this would be just be bad for business, this would be bad for research, and so on and so forth. So diplomacy also has to be ready to interact with those players and say, okay, how do I bring their concerns in, you know? And in Vienna, again, we heard that when we were talking about resources, the use of resources in space, you know, and then people say, okay, no, this is only a member state forum. Oh, yes, but this is a member state forum because that's the way it was conceived back in 1958, 59, when only states could afford, you know, the investment necessary to develop a space program. As Captain Kirk just showed us last week, this is no longer the case, right? So I got to mention that. I wanted to, you know, this is great. But anyway, so basically, I think we are going through a moment of change, very rapid change, not only in terms of space activities per se, but how we discuss and how we address that and how we deal with it, you know, and then suddenly, I think different stakeholders, especially the ones that are connected to governments, find themselves in a position where say, wait a minute, you know, I don't really know how to deal with that. And then when we look ahead, that's the title of my little presentation here. I think one of the things that we have to do is that we have to be very open-minded. I'm not saying that states will not have, in a sense, a prevalence or the upper hand, you know, when at the end of the day, when we try to come and agree on specific rules or norms or whatever you want, but we need to be more flexible and creative. And I think this will be key. But going back, the key point is that we have to have a shared understanding, and we need to agree on what we don't want to see. And I think this is a starting point that everyone can be comfortable with. We do not want a conflict in space. We cannot afford a conflict in space. There's too much at stake. And then from that point, I think we can make things happen, you know, rather than just focus sometimes on specific approaches. We'll continue to do that, but we need to be reminded of that, what we are working to achieve. And we are working to achieve a conflict-free environment. And I'll stop at that because I would really like to leave some time for questions and maybe Jessica to conclude, you know, what she was saying. It was so interesting, and I'm really sorry that she couldn't finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Maybe Jessica, you could work what's left of your presentation during the Q&A. Dr. Blackwell, I think you wanted to have the opportunity for the first question, right?
Yes, thank you. I suppose I should start with, well, maybe it's too general a question, but I mean, I'm coming at this from more of a international law background than a space security background. I'm thinking that rather than look to overhaul the entire sort of system of space governance, I'm suppose thinking in terms of an update to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, rather than seek to update and apply the whole structure of space governance, as it were, would it be easier for groups of nations to focus instead on specific issues and look for commonalities on, I'm sure work has already been done in these areas, but the management of space debris, proliferation or climate management? Is it easy to do it sector by sector rather than look to update the entire system of space governance? And I throw that out to anyone on the panel who may care to deal with that. Thank you. Jessica, right?
Yeah, I think this is really the essence of the focus on norms right now, is filling in the gaps that need to be filled in, or reconciling some of our principles with today's realities. And Alma was talking about the UK's process at UN First Committee, which is seeking to start a new international dialogue on this front. And to your point about states working together, she mentioned the UN Secretary General's report, which is online. I'll maybe post it in the chat after this. But there are key issues that stand out that states have a lot of common ground on, where I think we can work on this. One is to Kazuto's point on the need for better transparency and communication. There are very practical measures that many states identified, such as notifications, better direct communication with one another, data sharing to provide transparency, and the other is debris. Overwhelmingly, states pointed to debris as a security risk in space, and many also suggested they would support some sort of measure to restrict the testing of kinetic anti-satellite weapons in space. And that's an example of where you can see a step forward that might be possible on strategic issues that are tied in with safety and sustainability issues and don't necessarily require opening up, I think, what is really a phenomenal treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, a document that really sets us up well to take this approach going forward.
Thank you. Anyone else like to deal with that? Amidana? Yeah.
Hi, yes. So from a legal perspective, as you said, 100% agree with your assessment. In fact, the Outer Space Treaty and the other UN space treaties in general are kind of difficult to amend. So it doesn't make legal sense to just go through that whole process. And in fact, as Jessica said, the Outer Space Treaty has been a very successful treaty. I don't think there is a need to amend something that works. But it's true that, you know, the more proficient the international community has become when it comes to space activities, and the more active players that we have in the space domain, the more difficult it has become to reach legally binding agreements. And in fact, this trend stopped after the 80s. I think the Moon Agreement is the last significant international treaty on space issues. And the international community shifted to non-legally binding guidelines. For example, we have the LTS guidelines, the debris mitigation guidelines, which are both more copious documents, less related to security issues, although as Andrew pointed out, obviously all of these issues overlap. And so, yes, this is already happening. I think security might be the hardest subfield in which new mechanisms can be enacted, because it is such a contentious issue. And the fact that now we have so many players that are interested in having their voices heard and their opinions count also makes the process a lot harder. So with the Outer Space Treaty, you have essentially the only two spacefaring countries back then, which were the then USSR and the United States, bilaterally agreeing to the Outer Space Treaty. But now you have a lot more players that want to have a say. So it's a lot harder to come to a legally binding and even non-legally binding measures when there are so many opinions that have to be taken into consideration. And even with non-legally binding norms, as Jessica said, they are only as effective as states' willingness to comply with them. So this is something that has to be taken into account when talking about the effectiveness or how realistic it is to enact new measures. But this is something that is definitely being done. And as you say, an approach by different subfields is perhaps more efficient. But this is precisely what I think states are trying to achieve at the UN level.
Thank you. Jill, yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say I agree a lot with what Almudena had said, and I was going to say that it's my understanding that really we're at the end of the era of having major treaties, and the Moon Treaty was sort of the end of that, and that now we should be looking towards more sort of creative ways of overlapping or unpacking the current legislation that we have through intergovernmental agreements or memorandums of understanding, and so and that's partly because of the proliferation of entities that are active in space. So I'm glad that was said. That was what I was thinking as that question came up. One thing that I would like to ask though, and probably mostly to Jessica, I work on norms as well, but to anybody, what I think is interesting is as the cost of activity in space comes down, I think one of the reasons that we can establish compliance is because the entities that are invested in space have an interest in their reputation. So any country, for example, that has access to space is going to have the finances to be able to access space. As the cost of accessing space comes down, and through things like the ability to hack satellites through cybersecurity issues, are we going to start to see rogue elements who don't care about norms? And how is that going to change our approach to governance? If I can ask that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I haven't thought about it from that sort of, say, private sector, perhaps operator or smaller country perspective. But the part of the definition of norms that often gets lopped off is actors with a set identity. And so sets of behaviors, whether it seems good or bad, is generally attached to an identity. So as a good person, I take my shoes off in your home. As a good guest, as a good space operator, I mitigate debris and I deorbit as soon as I can, those kind of things. If we do start having, say at the state level, different identities proliferating, different groupings of governance approaches, in the West, we approach it this way and others approach it that way. I think that's a danger. And I think the challenge when it comes to security norms, hard security norms in particular, is what you're pointing at is that the ability to hide things and the lack of transparency, because it can be hard to have things stick. And so we have a lot of finger pointing in space. And I think being able to bring greater transparency to what's happening in the security domain would help encourage adherence to norms and develop norms themselves, because it is an iterative process between developing them and adhering to them. And so I'm also an advocate when it comes to data sharing. Space situational awareness, what's happening in orbit is key, but there's also things that happen on Earth that are important that we don't have a good eye on and that we don't exchange a lot of data on. And so starting to think more broadly about space Earth continuum and data sharing and bringing greater transparency to the military sector, I think would also help. But I'm going to think more on your point about other rogue actors in space. I was hoping we wouldn't go there. Although now I'm reminded of Rwanda's filing for 1/3 satellites and what's happening. I'm excited and want to know more.
Okay, Mr. Kazuto, I think you wanted to contribute.
Yes, I just wanted to add some what Jessica has mentioned about the rogue and norm, and this is a very fascinating subject when we talk about the how to contain the rogue actors. And I think if those are the small the startups or the small countries, then they would be it will be very difficult for having a bad social reputation, and a bad social reputation will reflect on the, let's say, the cost of insurance or the behavior for this behavior will pay for the next financing for another satellite or another series of satellites. So I think there will be a punishment. I think the power of norm comes from this, not just the finger pointing, but also the consequences of breaking the norms and getting off the norms, so that you may not be able to get the friends around you. You may not get the people borrowing money for you. So that sort of thing will work for the smaller players. The big question is that whether the big players, like the big states, the seafaring nations, will go rogue. And that's the problem that we are talking about. And I think, they are resilient. They don't have to worry about the financing next satellites or, the cost of insurance. They don't care about these things. So that won't deter their actions. So the bigger players are more resilient. Resistance to the pressure and the deterrence pressure from society, but the smaller players are more vulnerable to such a deterring action from the collective social pressure.
I don't know if you wanted to ask a question, Victoria. I've got something which builds on that discussion, but I can leave it if you want to ask a question, Victoria. I did, something occurred to me. There's been some discussion in Washington, not necessarily at an official level, but some people have wondered about, speculated about whether the US should lead a collective space security alliance. And I wanted to ask, well, one, is there any realistic prospect of this? And two, is it a good idea or not?
May I?
A space NATO, perhaps we could call it. I don't know. Yeah, please go ahead, please.
Well, I think any country is entitled to such an initiative. But the problem I see with that is that when we play along those lines and we mention even a word like NATO, and then I'll refer to something that Suzuki just said, we are creating a division. It's us versus them. And this is precisely what we have to try to avoid. I'm not saying that's easy, but for example, even when we talk about rogue states, and I think Kazuto made a very good point, and then, the big established spacefaring nations that can afford to go rogue or behave in a rogue manner and get away with it. Well, that's very interesting because we see that there are lots of aspiring space actors that, for a number of reasons, political, very often, may be denied, full access to space. And what happens that then these groups of countries, they will tend to cluster around a specific spacefaring nation that can provide them with access or services. And that will tend to reinforce a division. So if we talk about the United States or any country, that belongs to NATO leading an effort, I'm not sure if this is the way to go, honestly. I think if we talk about leading an effort in the sense of encouraging conversations and talks, that's all very well. But we would need to have a far more, a broader exercise. And then maybe we should get other countries to come and play a leading role, at least in maybe chairing this process, so that you don't associate it specifically with the United States, with Russia, with China, or whatever. We would need a more neutral actor, in a manner of speaking, to lead this. I think what we cannot really have is to really, going back to what I started saying, a division where we will have basically two blocks, because then we are repeating the same mistakes we had with the Cold War. And maybe at that time, that worked. I mean, we didn't have a full-scale conflict or something like that. But in space, I think this is just too risky, especially because of the complexity that we have now, because of the number of different actors we have now that we didn't have when we had the Cold War. The situation now is not the same. That, I think, what happened in the past can inform us so that we can make better decisions, but that cannot guide us towards the same path. The path has to be different. That would be my view.
Thank you very much. I think Dr. Whedon, Brian, you wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, I just want to chime in here, and I fully agree with sort of what Andre laid out with this. But the part of I guess the question is, where do you start? Do you try to start with sort of this broad agreement on how to interpret some principles, how to establish things, or do you start with a smaller group of countries that might be easier to come to agreement? You know, then that's the benefit of doing that. However, as Andre correctly pointed out, that then makes it harder to get all the countries involved. And if you have countries with different understandings or different agreements about how to interpret some of these principles and legal practices, or pushing on different sets of norms, that leads to other complications. So, I think what we have seen is the United States has been working with some of its more traditional allies to increase some of the cooperation among them and some of the integration of their space capabilities and doctrines. But that I think is not necessarily saying that that is how you solve this problem. I think that's more of a coordination aspect going on. And then there's a somewhat related but somewhat separate question about what we've been talking about, is how do you get countries to have a common understanding, at least of the way to of the principles of outer space activities and norms of behavior, and then move towards some sort of agreement. And just, what makes that more complicated than it was during the Cold War is you have many more countries directly involved in space activities, and you have I'll say just sort of a diversity of perspectives, of interests, of capacity, and that just makes getting all 100 countries currently involved in UN COPUOS to agree to something is just very, very difficult in this day and age.
Mr. Kazuto, I think you wanted to speak. I think we're almost running out of time. So if I could ask any last remarks to be quite brief, please. Mr. Kazuto, you had your hand raised.
Yeah. I'll just make a very quick comment. I agree with Andre and Brian, but I think what we need to keep in mind that space is not geographically divided. So, when you have the NATO, it's all about the territory, east, west, how to prevent the east coming to west, west coming to east. But you can't do that in space. You can't territorially control space. So whatever happens in space will affect everyone. Everyone who has a satellite, if you create debris, that debris may hit your satellite. And so creating a debris is a stupid thing because it hurts you. You're shooting your foot. So that is the nature of space, and that's why we need to have the common ground of behavior. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jessica, Dr. West, I think you had your hand up. Did you want to say, make a brief comment, please? Because I think we're almost out of time.
Yeah, very brief. So this concept is usually pitched as like-mindedness. We're going to start with like-minded countries and figure out what we want to do. And I think instead it's good to think of like-minded as a verb, as something we do continually, actively, and not as something we start with, even though you might kind of be starting there, but it's something to achieve rather than, I guess, a basis to begin governance with. And thinking about it that way might help get around this problem of where do we start and where are we going, and how do we deal with states that are not currently like-minded?
Thank you very much. I think perhaps it's time to close the session. Thank you to everyone. It's been an excellent discussion, and presentations have been very, very insightful and interesting. I wondered, Victoria, if you wanted to say a few words on behalf of the Secure World Foundation.
Sure, I do. Thank you. I just like to thank Trends for allowing us to partner with them on this event. And of course, I'd love to thank my speakers. All the panelists have been so insightful. And I hope that the one takeaway the audience will have from this is that space security is an issue that affects everyone. It's not just for the superpowers. And so all actors have a responsibility as users of space data, which everyone is, to be part of this conversation and to shape it in ways in which that is beneficial for all. So there's not an imposition, a gatekeeping cost for new users to space. Space security and stability actually helps relieve some of those costs, and that it becomes a predictable domain. So anyways, everyone has a role to play in this. very much looking forward to continuing this conversation, both in the Middle East and elsewhere. And I just like to thank everyone again for their time and thank the audience as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. And I'd just like to add very quickly, I'd like to express thanks on behalf of Trends Research and Advisory and sincere thanks to Secure World Foundation for helping us set up this event. Thank you to all our participants. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure our audience have enjoyed it and found it useful and interesting. And please keep up Trends. This is one of our series of Trends online events. I'd encourage all who wish to do so to follow our events, and I hope we can link up with each other in various different formats at some point in the future. Thank you all very much once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.